I'm Damon Wilson, the new president and CEO of the National Endowment for Democracy, and it's a real pleasure and honor to be here with you. I want to thank you for joining us for this event. As I said, it's the Carl Gershman Democracy Symposium, the fight for a democratic future. This title embodies Carl. He dedicated his life to this fight for a democratic future, and today's program is named in honor of Carl Gershman, NED's founding president, of course. Carl helped develop NED into America's foundation for freedom and democracy of what we see today, and we're here to honor that legacy today. We have the privilege to hear from Carl in just a few minutes. He's going to set the stage for our conversation over the course of the day. Carl, thank you for being with us here today. We're really looking forward to it, and thank you for everything you have done to ensure that the National Endowment for Democracy is ready for the challenges at hand that we'll talk about. Carl and I have had a chance to talk a lot during my own transition, and we share a sense of optimism, even ambition for what's possible, while of course we recognize the setbacks to democracy. But indeed, like many of you following today and in this room, we're motivated by those challenges. But we also recognize the strength of the endowment as an institution prepared for tough times, prepared for a long fight. And we also recognize and are inspired by the extraordinary resilience of Democrats around the world, some of whom are with us both in person and online. We'll be hearing from today. I'm also delighted at this symposium to announce today publicly the creation of the Gershman Fund for Democrats at Risk, something that honors Carl and the work that he cares so deeply about. Housed within the International Forum for Democratic Studies here at NED, the Carl Gershman Fund will help build the capacity, renew the energies, and expand the influence of courageous democracy advocates, with a special focus on those targeted by repressive governments for their democracy and human rights work. Put simply, the Gershman Fund expands our ability to defend Democrats at risk and help them get back on their feet and back out on the front lines of advancing democracy. So today we want to invite all of you following online to engage in this conversation using the pound NED Democracy, as well as the hashtag Carl Gershman 37. 37 remarkable years that we'll talk about today. So hashtag Carl Gershman 37. We're going to kick off in just a moment with our chairman, Ken Wollack, followed by our founding president, Carl Gershman, and they will set the tone for the rest of our conversation. I think it's important today to remember this isn't just an event. The best tribute to Carl is not just to reflect on his accomplishments to the cause of democracy and freedom around the world, but to engage in the serious work of how we advance that cause today. So that's why we're here. That's what we're going to do today. Indeed, Carl has shaped NED to become a leading center for democratic action and thought. And we're tapping into both of those traditions today with extraordinary activists, practitioners, strategists, and academics. Our first panel will have 4 outstanding activists, frontline activists who are engaged in the daily work of advancing democracy and rights in some of the world's most challenging environments. And our second conversation will turn to the challenge of democratic renewal, and we'll hear from some extraordinary first-rate thinkers and experts who are leaders and board members of the endowment about the very serious and complex threats to democracies and democratic values and what can be done to counter these negative trends. So with that, let's get on with the program. I now want to introduce NED's chairman, Kenneth Wollack, who will say a few words on his own before introducing Carl. I think everyone in this audience knows Ken is the chairman of the board of directors of the National Endowment for Democracy. He's also among the reasons I was so proud to join NED under his leadership. Ken is a co-chair of the Commission on Presidential Debates, a member of the Advisory Committee for the U.S. Agency for International Development, and on the George W. Bush's Institute Advisory Council on Human Freedom. Like Carl, Ken is also an icon in the field of democracy support, who has been helping those on the front lines throughout his career and helping to call on our nation to live up to its values. For more than 25 years, he served, of course, as president of the National Democratic Institute, a remarkable tenure of one of NED's family's core institutes, a family that we are so proud to have built with these institutes across the 2 parties, Democrats and Republicans, and across business and labor. In my just a little bit more than 6 weeks on the job, Ken has been a terrific partner, leader, and counselor. So thank you, Ken, for your own leadership and for your own remarkable contribution to democracy around the world. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Damon. What he didn't mention is I retired 3 years ago, and this is not what I thought retirement would look like. But thank you very much, Damon. You have led a remarkably smooth transition in only 8 weeks. This in spite of an ongoing crisis and evacuating staff and partners in Afghanistan. We at the Endowment family are fortunate to benefit from your passion, your energy, and your leadership. It is only fitting that these 2 symposiums are part of Ned's testimonial to Carl Gershman and his legacy at the Endowment. That is because Carl has the head of an intellectual and believes passionately in the power of the thoughts, words, and writings of the intellectual. At the same time, he has the heart of a political activist who brought his engagement with the grassroots civil rights movement here to the mission and work of the Endowment. And today's symposium includes both disciplines. My former chairman of the National Democratic Institute, Madeleine Albright, has described herself as an optimist who worries a lot. That is an apt description for Carl as well. And if you look at the titles of our 2 panel discussions, they are led by the words challenge and fight. That is probably appropriate given the 15 years of a global democratic recession, the rise of malign actors, and the spread of authoritarianism, often on the ashes of democratic transitions. I have no doubt that our panelists will analyze these negative trends, and I am sure we will learn from their insights. I want to also point to the opportunities and optimistic outlooks, because that too would reflect Carl's worldview and the resilience and courageous efforts of the democratic activists on our first panel. When Carl became president of the NED 38 years ago, he needed a heavy dose of optimism because the world was pretty bleak. Latin American countries were largely run by military juntas. Soviet occupation extended to the borders of Western Europe. During the previous 25 years, only 3 African leaders had retired or stepped down peacefully after losing an election. The military was in power in Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Korea. An absolute monarchy ruled Bangladesh. Dictators exercised power in Indonesia, the Philippines, and Mongolia. Martial law was in place in Taiwan, and even the lexicon of democracy had hardly surfaced in the Middle East. While we certainly cannot dismiss a serious democratic decline over the past decade and a half and the challenges going forward, there are nevertheless signs of optimism. The first is the demand for freedom and democracy in every region of the world. We know this by public opinion research, large-scale protests in every region of the world, and the results of elections, even those that are stage-managed, from Armenia to Zambia. People are in a demanding mood. They want food on their tables and a roof over their heads, but also a political voice. And they are not willing to forfeit the latter for the former. Second, there exists today a global democracy architecture that did not exist 40 years ago. It is made up of governments, intergovernmental organizations, donor aid agencies, foundations, and networks of civil society groups, political parties, and parliaments. The architecture operates imperfectly, but the language of democracy often governs international discourse. So in the midst of dark assessments, I would implore our panelists to find room for a smidgen of well-placed optimism. Carl would like that. Mark Salter, the longtime aide to John McCain, seemed to capture Carl's calling when he described the late senator's worldview. And I quote Mark, "The most marvelous of human achievements," he said, "is not to lose hope when experience has taught you hope is for fools." With that, I turn the floor over to our honoree today, a worried optimist, Carl Gershman.
Thank you, Ken, for that great introduction for this morning's discussion and for your kind words. And thanks too to Damon for, getting off to such a strong start. And, when you were on the job less than a month, the real crisis broke in Afghanistan. And, as you were meeting with everyone on staff and preparing for your first board meeting, somehow you did everything you could to try to help rescue our friends and grantees and partners in Afghanistan. And, I'm very grateful to you for that and for your kind words. Like both Ken and Damon, I just want to, again, call attention to the appropriateness of the structure of our discussion this morning, focusing on both the activist side of NED, the grantees. And I want to thank the whole program team. I see a lot of them here, Brian, Barbara, and the whole program team for making the grants program what Forum 2000 has called a thriving hub of countless pro-democracy efforts across the world. And it's extraordinary. But the fact that that forum, that the grantees, the activists are linked to the forum the way they are, I think is one of the things that makes NED such a special and such a unique organization. The ideas dimension, the intellectual dimension of NED, which is so extraordinary. And Mark, who with Larry founded the Journal of Democracy, which is now being edited so well by Will Dobson, and then Chris, who's running the forum, and Xerxes, who's running the fellowship program. I really want to thank all of them. And I just want to make a few brief points this morning. As everyone knows and has said, this is not a good time for democracy, and I'm sure we'll, of course, hear a lot more about that from our panelists. But we also know that NED was built for tough times, and that the awesome challenges that democracy now faces have made NED a stronger and a more indispensable institution. I really believe that. I mean, if everything were fine, people would say, who needs it? And we also know that our own democracy is in trouble, and that polarization in the United States is very deep, and that the internal crisis affects the fate of democracy around the world. This is, of course, a source of profound concern, but while it is not part of our global democracy mission to address the problems of democracy in the United States, our mission is embedded in national legislation, and we use American taxpayer dollars to carry out that mission. So somehow who we are and what we do, I hope, will remind Americans that the idea of democracy is something which holds our whole country together. And we have to work to strengthen that, even as the NED is focused on democracy internationally. And moreover, in a way that I would not have anticipated at the beginning of NED, our two-party institutes were very controversial at the beginning of NED, and they were a source of vulnerability for the institution. Congress at one point prohibited funding to the party institutes. But ironically, in a way, in today's polarized environment, they provide a kind of bipartisan ballast, which provides stability and helps keep NED afloat and accepted by both sides of our very divided political spectrum. So this is another way in which the NED, I think, is built to survive and to prevent and to be resilient in tough times the way we're in right now. The world has changed, obviously, dramatically since the NED was founded, and perspectives on democracy and our mission have changed as well during that period. I can remember in 2005, our former board member, the late Mark Palmer, who was very much involved in the founding of NED, and I think is rightly considered to have been the principal drafter of Reagan's Westminster Address, published a book entitled Breaking the Real Axis of Evil. This was 2005, in which he set the ambitious goal for American foreign policy of eliminating all the remaining dictatorships in the world by 2025. And I think at the time there were 46, according to the book. And, you know, well, it obviously hasn't happened that way. There are more dictatorships now than there were when Mark wrote, and just in the last couple of months, you know, we can regretfully, tragically add, you know, Afghanistan to that list now, and also Tunisia. So it hasn't worked out that way. And Marty Lipset, who was, you know, one of our great scholars of democracy, was writing in 1995. He had come to a dinner that we had organized for our Democracy Award, and he was so moved by the dinner, and he was worried. He was worried that Congress might abolish the NED during this decade of complacency after the end of the Cold War, and really after the peaking of the third wave of democratization. He said, "What can I do?" And I said, "Marty, write an article." And so Marty wrote this article in which he said, look, the struggle between authoritarianism and democracy in the world did not begin with the Cold War, and it did not end with the collapse of communism in the 1989-91 period. There was, you know, this feeling that the battle was over. And he said, the battle is not over. In every country in the world, he said, you know, there is an authoritarian party and a democratic party. And he then said, inelegantly, an anti-American party and a pro-American party. And, you know, there may not be the importance of nuclear weapons, and submarines may not be as important as it was during the Cold War, but the battle goes on, and it would be a profound mistake for the United States to abandon the field of struggle, even though it is now far less costly. But we should not abandon the field of struggle to build free societies for the 21st century and beyond, and that's really where we are. The battle goes on, in other words, and it will be a very long and a continuing struggle. It also seems clear to me in the aftermath of Afghanistan that the U.S. is going to be very, very reluctant to use military force, and that the so-called ideological struggle, the battle of ideas, the battle of information, the battle of politics, the battle of civil society will become more central than ever, certainly than ever since the fall of communism. And this is our space. And so the NED's role is likely to grow over time and become even more important than it has been and that it is now. We can't do it alone, of course, and we have to hope that our government and its allies will be wise enough and strong enough to help preserve the peace and geopolitical stability and to defend democratic norms internationally. And as Frank Fukuyama has repeatedly pointed out, it's not just a non-governmental struggle that we're involved in. State building is very critical to the future of democracy, and that's something government development agencies and other agencies will have to do, aside from preserving the peace. And there are ways that NED and its institutes can also contribute to strengthening the institutions of governance, aiding groups that fight to reduce corruption and promote effective governments. The pressure for effective governance can help build state institutions, as does free media and open information space, without which democratic governance is not conceivable. And our party institutes work with political leaders and parliamentarians to train them to govern effectively. And SIPE has supported groups like the Institute of Economic Affairs in Ghana that engenders private sector economic growth, and they do this with groups all over the world. and the Philippines-based Institute for Solidarity in Asia that implements performance-based governance systems in localities and cities. And our World Movement for Democracy does this type of work with its connection and networking of crossovers, civil society activists who go into government when there is a transition to give government its skills. And this is a growing trend in transitional countries. But with the role of the United States so uncertain in the period ahead, the leadership in the struggle for democracy, in my view, will inevitably have to come from the popular grassroots citizen movements around the world, the people at the grassroots who are fighting for democratic rights and decent governance, and to have their voices heard and their dignity respected. They will be leading from the front, to borrow an Obama phrase, and it will be our job to ensure that they are not alone. We can do this not only by providing assistance and training and solidarity, but also by mobilizing public support and pressure to keep the political space open for these groups to do their work, to get our government and international agencies and the media involved in calling attention to their struggle. After almost 4 decades, the net and its institutes have the experience, the staff, the capacity, the contacts, and now the funding as well, to provide the support that these citizen movements will need to survive, to grow, and over time to prevail. Our job will be to stay the course with the right combination of solidarity, skill, intellect, and humility. That's the task ahead, and I know that others on the panel this morning will be shedding more light on this, and I look forward to the discussion. Thanks very much.